All right, who has ever experienced pain in their body or in their life before? Mentally, physically? Who's ever looked at someone and felt pain for them just by looking at them? So there I was. It was December of 2006. We're preparing for the holidays. I'm going away with a group of friends. And I'm in my room packing. I've got this high-top leather bed. It's really high to get up. I'm packing. In walks this 17-year-old kid. He's part of our group. That's going away with us for the week. Plops down in this big plush green leather chair that I've got there. I think he's just, coming to have a conversation with me. He sits there. He's quiet for a minute. Then he proceeds to tell me that he is going to commit suicide, and he is going to kill himself. Immediately, I try to act like I'm still packing, doing what I'm doing, to not let the shock and whatever other emotions I'm experiencing at the moment, which I felt my hands getting clammy, my breath was short, my heart's beating fast. And I also knew in that very moment, as I looked at him and connected for a moment, that it took a lot of courage for him to walk into my room, sit down, and to speak those words out loud. And I found myself in a state of, I could be judgmental, I could be demanding, I could demand that he get help, or I could just let all that go. And I found myself in a very curious place. I was curious, and I started asking him questions. How are you going to kill yourself? When are you going to kill yourself? What are you going to do to kill yourself? And knowing him very closely, in his true Virgo fashion, he had planned everything out for his funeral, except for the song that he wanted to be played. And that was why he'd come into my room. He wanted help picking out a song. So 10 years later, as I am facing my own suicidal ideation, after falling out with my children, and as I'm moving furniture to the door of my office to make sure that I don't go out into the street, one of the busiest corners there in Phoenix, Arizona, and walk into traffic, I found myself remembering that conversation. And I became curious myself. And I remembered in that conversation with him that I held space for him to voice those words out loud. And I found myself reaching out to a designated listener that I have for myself. And I began a conversation with her. And she was the same way. She was curious. And I had already kind of set this up, like, no judgment. I don't want your pet. Just listen to me. And I found through that conversation that my children are my soul's quiet whisper within me. They're my guiding light. And I found myself wanting to become the very best version, first to prove them wrong, and then I realized it wasn't about that. It was really for me to go be my best version as their father, would inspire them to live their best lives. And I knew, with all the work that I had done, that it would begin to heal the ancestral ties that we have for both past, present with my children, and also with their children. Now a grandfather of a 4-year-old and a grandfather-to-be.
Yes.
So I'm Jesse James. I have, as James said, I've been a somatic detective body worker since 2001. I've amassed close to 30,000 hours of body work. And through being a physical and emotional empath, deeply intuitive, and listening to my soul's quiet whisper, having these kind of conversations with my clients and the kind of body work that I do became known as the Jesse James method. Now, how I first became connected to this conversation about pain is when I was going through school. And I've lived in chronic pain my entire life. And so pain for me was just part of my day-to-day. It was just how I lived life. As many of us do, if I were to go and touch any one of you in this room, I would find a pain point in your body that you had no idea you had. And I look at all those pain points as our nervous system really only allows us to feel and experience kind of 3 main pain points. Other than that, we start to numb out. And over time, when there's an accident or an injury, we do start to numb out to that pain. And then we start walking, in funny ways, or we start having weird headaches, and we don't know where that came from. So I'm 44 years old. Not now, I'm 54 now, but I was 44, 2014, and I'm sitting there after living in pain for 44 years, and I'm about to get prolotherapy in my neck, and my shoulders, my elbows, and my wrist. And as I'm sitting there, and the naturopath is injecting me with the lidocaine to numb out, to prepare me to get the prolotherapy, I suddenly felt like this wash of peace just go over my body. I started moving my neck, and I realized for the first time in my life, it was the first time in my life that I was not experiencing pain. And my body went into the next 5 hours of crying and sobbing. And it wasn't just like little tears. It was like, I couldn't even stop. It was 5 hours of releasing all that emotion and pain that had been with me up until that point. Later, when I relayed that story to my mom, she started crying. And she said, most likely, that pain in your neck started when you were 9 months old. See, up until that point, I grew up with a mom we grew up in a cult, and she believed with all her heart. I was born with a cleft lip, cleft palate, cleft gum. She believed with all her heart that if she prayed hard enough, that I would be healed. And finally, after 9 months, I wasn't. And she allowed me to, or my grandparents kind of forced her, but I had surgery finally to repair. But up until that point, all my mom did was hold me and look at me as pure, pure perfection, that I was a pure soul. She looked at me and she infused me with so much love. I had the surgery, and what happened in the surgery is, as a 9-month-old, I kept hitting the stitches out. So back in 1970, what did the doctors do? They tied me to the table, so to the crib. So for the next 2.5 weeks, that's how I laid while my stitches healed. The moment my mom told me that, my body viscerally could feel me laying in that crib as a 9-month-old. I could feel my head was like this. And that's how I laid pretty much for the whole time. She said I screamed bloody murder pretty much the whole time for the 2.5 weeks. And even as I've been working on sharing this with you, over the last couple of weeks, I could even hear more. As I'm laying there, I was like, oh, I could hear the sound of the beeping of the machine coming from this side. So those memories are all locked in there. So that was 2014. And what I realized is that there's an event that happens. At some point in all of our lives, there's an event that happens. And from that event, we begin to have some thoughts about it. And sometimes those thoughts can be very positive or happy thoughts, but mostly those thoughts sometimes become not so happy or great thoughts. And we begin to create some kind of a victim mentality about the event that happened. Left unprocessed, untalked about, undealt with over time begins to create dis-ease in our body. And that left unprocessed begins to create pain, chronic pain, and disease in our body. That's why you see so many people that walk around with disease in our bodies, because all those emotions that got trapped in are left unhealed, unprocessed. And so what I invite you to consider is that at some point, all of you have or will experience some form of pain in your life, whether it's dealing with suicide or some kind of an accident or some kind of pain in your life. And I invite you to, just like I did in the conversation with the young man and just like I created with my friend, is that I'm going to let my inner nerd come out here for a second because I like acronyms. So I'd like for each of us to become a DACL. And you say, what is a DACL? What is a DACL?
What's a deckle?
So this is how each of us can begin today. Just like I did with that young man, and just like I was for myself, and just like I have for 30,000 plus hours of work with clients, is that D, that you become a designated, active, curious listener. And you can begin that today. Begin that with yourself. Go home at the end of the day. Maybe make a note. Jesse James, he talked about being a DACL. Okay, he talked about overcoming pains of life. All right, start with your body. Just close your eyes, maybe lay in bed. Start with your toes. Maybe feel your toes, wiggle your toes. Work all the way up your body. Where do you feel pain, or where do you not have freedom in your body that you would like to have? like you were when you were a baby. Like we could fall and be okay. Most of the time, depends on how much we fall. And start making some notes about that, journaling, and begin asking. Engage with yourself. Be curious with yourself. How did this happen? When did it happen? What was going on around me when it happened? Because that question, not only about like, I could trip my toe, but what was I thinking about? Or I could trip and hit my toe, whatever, you know? But what was happening in my thoughts when that happened? That's what I'm more curious about. Not long ago, I fell in Miami. I fell on 3 little steps. And I'm always looking at life is always happening for me, not to me. And so I was curious in that very moment, okay, why did this just happen? I couldn't even get up or move for 20 minutes. And out of my voice, I kept hearing, Jesse, you're going to be okay. You got this. Over and over. That's all that came out. What came out of that, though, is that I'd had carpal tunnel in these 3 fingers really bad from camping and being super cold for 2 years. And just from that little fall of hitting my wrist so hard on the concrete, it cleared up my carpal tunnel. Totally, completely gone. That's because I lived my life curious like that. Every little accident does not mean that I have to be a victim to that. Somebody says something doesn't mean I have to be a victim to whatever I think I heard them say. They're dealing with whatever they're dealing with. And so I invite you to be curious. What was going on when you had that accident or that event in your life? Because as Amanda so brilliantly said, all those beads, they all string together. And if you can go back to the origin of that, it begins to unravel all that pain. It's crazy. It works every single time. Again, preparing for this, I'm having this conversation with one of my clients. He's 26 years old. And this is our 7th session, I think, that we've worked together. And he's got tons of restriction in his hips. And so we've been working on that. And then finally, I engaged him in this conversation. And sure enough, he's 10 months old. He's on the back of a sofa. He falls off the back of the sofa, and he goes, they must have kept all the sharp objects behind the sofa in my house, because he had 35 stitches across his face into his jaw leading down. Well, if you imagine for a second, the body is a miraculous machine. If you just imagine for a second, your jaw, your head, take it off, set it into your pelvis, it's designed exactly the same. So if you're doing pelvic floor work and you're doing jaw work, they're both going to get released. So I'm sitting here doing pelvic floor work. We're working on his jaw. He comes back the next day, he's like, I can totally do movement that I haven't been able to do. Had we done anything different in the previous 6 sessions? No. It was simply getting back to the origin of when did that restriction happen and the emotion that happened around that created the freedom. So that's why having conversations, being curious and talking about your pain to yourself, but also then begin to have a DACL in your life, or be a DACL, where you can engage in these conversations. And what I see is possible for the world is that each of us, you don't have to go see somebody with 30,000 hours of work like myself, but begin that conversation just with you. Begin it with the person next to you. Begin it with whoever you thought of that came to mind when I asked you that question. Like, who could you be a designated, active, curious listener for? And who would you like to be that for as well? So I invite you, that is your homework. I invite you to go think about that, not only for yourself, begin healing yourself. Your body, I'm 54 years old now, so to finish that story, is I started my first release of chronic pain in my neck when I was 44 years old. 4 years later, after that fall, it went back into chronic pain. 10 minutes on a medical device, a machine, I was out of pain again. 4 years later, a little bit more pain in my neck. Started using some pain sprays. And within 3 months, gone. And now 2.5 years later, I've had no pain in my neck for 2.5 years. So that took 8 years. So it does take some time. But be curious, and your body will heal. And have some intention and expectation that will happen, because it will happen. Thank you very much. It's been an honor to be here. I love you, all of you, for being here, because that means you're someone that's curious. So thank you. I'm Jesse James.